My husband died 5 years earlier, and since then my life moved in careful circles around duty and survival. Every month without fail I sent $200 to his parents as repayment for a debt they said he left behind. I lived by a calendar, where the fifth day meant envelopes and stares and guilt. I was 32, then a widow, raising a little boy named Noah on a modest salary. Every dollar I mailed or handed over felt like a cut from our future. Money meant for milk, tutoring, shoes, and the small joys a child deserves, but I swallowed it, because I believed it was the last promise I could keep to the man I once loved. The building where my in-laws lived stood like a tired relic in Chicago, an old brick walk-up that smelled of damp walls and old drains. I parked my aging sedan in the same corner spot marked by fading red paint and tucked the envelope into my purse. My name is Erica, and that envelope always felt heavier than its weight. The climb to the 5th floor was a ritual of sounds and smells that etched themselves into my nerves. Radios blaring on the lower floors, burnt food and arguments drifting through thin walls. By the time I reached the top, everything went quiet in a way that made my chest tighten. The door to apartment 504 was painted a cheerful blue that never matched the chill it carried. Inside lived my husband's parents, Harold and Lorraine, both in their early 60s yet worn down by bitterness and suspicion. I knocked and waited through the familiar silence until Lorraine cracked the door with the chain still latched. Her eyes darted like someone guarding a secret. I greeted her, and handed over the envelope saying it was for her medicine and needs. She snatched it without a word and tucked it away without counting. She asked about Noah without meeting my eyes and dismissed my offer to bring him by. Always another excuse about headaches, or bad legs, or too much noise. The door closed with a final click that echoed in my bones. I lingered there longer than I should have, listening for signs of life behind the metal. A television, a cough, anything that would make it feel like a home. Instead, there was only a thick silence that made the hallway feel like a tomb. As I turned to leave, a cold draft crawled up my back and a question burned in my mind about why. 5 years of payments had not softened them toward their only grandchild. I did not know then that eyes watched me through a narrow gap in the blinds. Eyes sharp and calculating that did not belong to an old man worn by age. Down in the courtyard, sunlight and noise rushed back to life. Children played, women chatted, and for a moment I could breathe again. I was walking toward my car when a firm hand caught my wrist. It was Mrs. Coleman, a longtime tenant, known for her watchful ways and blunt truths. She drew me to sit beside her and lowered her voice. She told me to stop sending money and to look at the security camera. Her words made no sense at first, but the seriousness in her face made my skin prickle. She spoke of late-night footsteps of a man climbing the stairs of that building, of a familiar limp and a shadow that appeared after my visits. She insisted she saw him unlock the door like it was his own home. My heart pounded as I tried to dismiss it as confusion or age, but her conviction shook me. She told me a camera had been installed between the 4th and 5th floors and urged me to find the footage. The drive to pick up Noah felt unreal, like moving through water. Chicago traffic blurred as memories rearranged themselves in my mind. Lorraine always demanding cash without fail, the blinds always shut even in summer heat, their insistence on monthly payments despite steady pensions. I nearly swerved when the thought struck that the money might be supporting someone else. Noah ran into my arms outside his school and I held him tighter than usual, feeling fear coil under my ribs. That night, after dinner and bedtime, I sat at my computer staring at the budget notebook where the debt was circled in red. 58 months paid with 2 left to go. Suspicion ate at me as I remembered my husband Daniel breaking his left ankle years before and walking with a slight drag ever since. I called my cousin Lucas, who had a talent for computers and quiet favors. I asked him about accessing the building cameras under the excuse of a lost wallet. The next day we met in a small coffee shop where he opened his laptop and pulled up grainy footage from the early morning hours of the 6th day of the previous month. The hallway was empty until a man climbed into view wearing a cap and mask. My breath caught as he stepped up with his right foot, then dragged the left ever so slightly. The shoulder dipped the way I knew too well. I asked Lucas to slow it down, and the truth hit me with crushing clarity. The man reached apartment 504 and unlocked it with practiced ease before slipping inside. We watched the same scene repeat across months, always after my payment day. Nausea rolled through me as grief twisted into something darker. I took the copied footage home and locked myself in my bedroom, replaying it until the room felt too small. The jacket the man wore was one I had given Daniel before he left for work out of state. The memories of his supposed death came rushing back. The hurried cremation, the ashes delivered without a body to see the way his parents pushed the debt on me before the ground had even settled. Anger burned through the sadness as I realized how carefully they had played me. Nearly $14,000 when counting extras for holidays and medicine. Money wrung from long hours and sacrifice. I stared at the smiling photo on the makeshift shrine and felt resolve harden inside. May whispered that I would play along a little longer, while I took control of the story. I began writing a plan in a notebook to confirm the man's identity, investigate the family finances, and uncover where Daniel was hiding. The next morning life went on as usual with breakfast, school, and work, but inside me something had shifted. I sent Lucas a message asking him to quietly check bank activity for Harold and Lorraine. Later that afternoon, I returned to the building and spoke with a neighbor, Mrs. Parker, who mentioned late night noise, pizza boxes, and beer cans tossed out regularly. Things that did not fit the image of struggling elders. Each detail tightened the net in my mind. 2 days later, I visited my in-laws again, carrying a gift, and arrived early enough to hear voices through the door. Lorraine spoke to a man calling him son, telling him to spend freely now that I had paid. The voice that answered was unmistakable, even roughened by time. It was Daniel planning to disappear once the payments ended. Rage surged through me, but I kept my composure and knocked. They scrambled to hide him and forced me away with clumsy excuses. That cough I heard from the back room sealed it, when Lucas later showed me proof that the pensions sat untouched, and the cash I funded everything. I felt the final pieces lock into place. Daniel was alive, hiding nearby, and feeding off my labor. And this was only the beginning of what I would uncover. The realization that my husband was alive did not bring relief or reunion. It brought a cold, focused fury that followed me through every routine of my day. I moved through work and errands like an actress playing herself, smiling when required, answering emails, making dinner, helping Noah with homework. But beneath it all, my mind was calculating timing and evidence. Every memory from the past 5 years now looked different, as if a veil had been torn away. Loren's sharp tone, Harold's refusal to meet my eyes, the locked blinds, the insistence on cash. It all pointed to a long-practiced deception that had used my grief as fuel. Lucas called me 2 mornings later asking me to meet him again. We sat in the same quiet coffee shop, but this time his face was serious. He showed me spreadsheets and timelines explaining how Harold and Lorraine's pension checks arrived each month, untouched and untouched, they stayed. Number withdrawals, no expenses, nothing to suggest hardship. The account balances grew steadily year after year. Tens of thousands sitting idle while they complained of poverty to neighbors and guilted me into payments. I asked him how they lived if they never touched the money, and he answered with one word: cash. Cash brought by someone who did not want a digital trail. Someone who arrived at night and left before dawn. The truth stung more sharply than if they had truly been poor. Greed had driven them, not need. I asked Lucas if he thought Daniel was involved in something illegal to justify hiding so completely. He hesitated, then admitted it was likely. People who fake deaths usually run from more than family obligations. He promised to dig into Daniel's old contacts and employment history to see what surfaced. I thanked him and left feeling the weight of years press on my shoulders. I had been mourning a man who chose to abandon his child and bleed his wife dry. Grief slowly hardened into resolve to get closer to the truth. I decided to act normal. I continued my visits and payments without change, playing the obedient widow until the final installment. Each trip to the 5th floor now felt different, as if I were walking onto a stage, knowing the script was false. I listened more, watched more, noted every sound behind the door. One evening, I overheard laughter, a deep male laugh, quickly muffled. Another time, the smell of beer drifted into the hallway. Each clue fed my certainty. Lucas later told me he found something useful. A name from Daniel's past that kept resurfacing in his search. A man named Trevor Hale, known among friends as Buzz. They had worked and ridden motorcycles together years ago, and Buzz now managed a repair shop across the state line in Indiana. The shop had odd financial flags and reports of after-hours activity. Lucas suspected it was a front for something else. My pulse quickened as he spoke. This was the first real lead beyond the apartment walls. I remembered Trevor from the funeral day, how he cried loudly, promised to look after us, then vanished from our lives. I searched his social media late that night while Noah slept. Photos of parties, bikes, stacks of cash, and one image made my breath catch. Trevor raised a beer mug wearing a watch with a blue face and metal band. It was the watch I had given Daniel on our anniversary, engraved with our initials. Even the small scratch near the clasp was visible. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. There was no innocent explanation left. I sent everything to Lucas, who confirmed my suspicion. The photo was recent and tagged in Gary, Indiana. He told me he could trace Trevor's movements through indirect means, and within a day he came back with disturbing consistency. Trevor spent most nights partying, but around 11 he always drove to an abandoned warehouse near the industrial park, staying there for about an hour before returning home. The location was isolated, rarely patrolled, and ideal for hiding someone. I knew then where Daniel was. Not in some distant place, but close enough to be fed and protected by an old friend despite the fear clawing at my chest. I felt strangely calm. Knowledge replaced confusion and anger sharpened my focus. I told Lucas I wanted proof, undeniable proof of Daniel alive and complicit. He warned me it was dangerous, that people tied to underground money were not harmless, but I refused to involve police without evidence they could not ignore. We agreed to work together carefully and quietly. This was no longer about money alone, it was about reclaiming my life and protecting my child. Before confronting the warehouse, I needed to close one last lie: the story of Daniel's death itself. I called the man who had delivered the ashes years ago, a company representative named Mr. Keller. I told him I needed original reports for insurance processing. His hesitation spoke volumes. He claimed records were minimal, handled through emergency channels, and might not exist anymore. His nervous tone confirmed my suspicions that the documentation had been fabricated or rushed through with bribes. After the call, I sat in silence, realizing how many adults had played a role in this deception. I decided then to visit Daniel's hometown under the pretense of paying respects now that the debt was finished. Lorraine objected weakly but allowed it, believing sentimentality would not threaten her scheme. That weekend I drove with Noah through endless cornfields under a harsh yellow sun. My son chatted excitedly about tractors and meeting distant relatives while I gripped the wheel, fighting the ache in my chest. He deserved honesty and stability, not shadows and lies. Relatives welcomed us warmly and spoke of Daniel with affection. Each comment cut deeper, knowing the truth. I excused myself after lunch, saying I wanted to take Noah to the cemetery. The columbarium stood quiet under the trees, its rows of niches polished and still. Daniel's plaques smiled back at me with dates that now felt like mockery. I asked Noah to play nearby while I spoke to his father, and waited until the grounds were empty. With shaking hands, I unlocked the small glass door and lifted the urn. It was lighter than it should have been. My heart hammered as I pried open the sealed lid. Inside there were no ashes, only dust and construction stones. My knees buckled as reality settled into my bones. This was not just abandonment, it was a deliberate ritual of cruelty. I recorded everything carefully, my voice steady, despite tears, sealing the urn again exactly as I found it. The truth was now preserved beyond denial. On the drive back to Chicago, Noah slept unaware, while I replayed the footage in my mind. That night in a motel room, I continued searching Trevor's profiles and connections. Everything pointed back to the industrial park. I sent Lucas the new evidence, and he replied quickly, telling me it was enough to move forward. We planned to observe the warehouse firsthand, following Trevor's routine. My fear transformed into determination. The man I once loved was gone, replaced by someone I did not recognize, and would no longer protect the night before we planned to go. I stood in my living room watching Noah sleep, his chest rising and falling peacefully. I promised him silently that this would end soon, that no more money would be stolen from his future, and no more lies would shape our lives. Outside, the city hummed, unaware of the storm about to break. And for the first time since Daniel's supposed death, I felt in control. The hunt was no longer abstract, it had a location, a name, and a time. And I was ready to face whatever waited in the shadows. The night we chose to follow Trevor felt heavier than the humid air pressing down on the city. Lucas picked me up after sunset in a borrowed car with dull paint and quiet brakes. Both of us dressed in dark clothes that blended into shadows. Neither of us spoke much during the drive south. The road lights slid past like pale ghosts, and my thoughts kept circling back to Noah. Asleep at my mother's house, believing his mother was just working late again. I held on to that lie like a shield, because if he knew even a fraction of the truth, it would break something precious inside him. We crossed into Indiana, and the city thinned into stretches of empty road and low industrial buildings. Lucas slowed as we reached the industrial park and cut the headlights before turning onto a service lane. Weeds grew through cracked asphalt and rusted fences leaned like tired sentries. We parked far from the cluster of abandoned warehouses and continued on foot. The night hummed with insects and distant machinery. My heart pounded so loudly, I feared it would give us away. We crouched behind stacked pallets and watched the road. Lucas checked his phone quietly, confirming Trevor's location, moving closer. Minutes stretched until the sound of a motorcycle cut through the dark. Its headlights swept across the empty lot before stopping near a wide metal shutter. Trevor climbed off, removing his helmet with casual ease, carrying two bulging plastic bags. He knocked on the shutter in a practiced rhythm, and the door groaned open, spilling yellow light onto the ground. Then I saw him. Daniel stepped forward from inside, thinner, rougher, his hair long and unkempt, a beard shadowing his face. But the shape of him, the way he stood, the tilt of his head erased any doubt. My breath caught painfully in my chest as years of mourning collided with this living proof. I wanted to scream his name to demand answers, but my body stayed frozen as if fear and rage had glued me to the spot. Lucas guided me closer to a crack in the warehouse wall and placed a small recorder in my hand. Inside, the men laughed and opened beers, their voices carrying easily through the thin metal. Daniel complained about the heat, mosquitoes, and waiting for the last payment. He mocked me openly, calling me predictable, praising his parents' acting skills, and boasting about how icily he had controlled the story. Every word felt like a blade cutting away the man I thought I knew. Trevor joked about karma, and Daniel laughed, dismissing it as superstition. He admitted gambling debts, mob threats, and the fake death as a solution to save himself. He spoke of Noah with cold indifference, saying I would move on eventually and that taking my money kept me too busy to question anything. Tears streamed down my face silently as I recorded every confession, every cruel laugh, every admission of betrayal. Lucas signaled that we had enough and guided me away before my emotions could betray us. We returned to the car without being seen and drove back in silence. My hands shook uncontrollably and my chest ached as if something vital had been ripped out. Yet beneath the pain was clarity, sharp and unwavering. The man I loved was gone, replaced by someone capable of abandoning his child and exploiting his grief-stricken wife without remorse. Next morning we met a lawyer Lucas trusted and laid out everything: the footage, the recordings, the empty urn, the financial records. The lawyer listened with growing anger, explaining the charges that would follow: fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and abuse of trust. He contacted the police immediately, and within hours, plans were set into motion. Teams would move simultaneously to prevent escape, one to the warehouse, one to Harold and Lorraine's apartment, and one for waited at the station, pacing a worn floor while officers moved around me with calm efficiency. The hours crawled until finally a detective approached, confirming all targets were detained without incident. Relief flooded me so suddenly my knees nearly gave out. The nightmare that had haunted my life for 5 years was finally ending. Seeing Daniel through the interrogation room glass was surreal. Handcuffed, hollow-eyed, stripped of bravado. When confronted with the evidence, he confessed quickly, his voice flat as if admitting the weather. Harold and Lorraine cried in another room, blaming fear and parental love, but their excuses rang hollow against the weight of their actions. Trevor faced his own charges tied to illegal lending and concealment. The web they spun collapsed under its own lies. The trial, months later, drew attention and whispers, but I focused on one thing: justice. Daniel received a long prison sentence while his parents avoided jail due to age but were ordered to repay every dollar taken from me. Walking out of the courthouse into bright sunlight felt like stepping into a new life. The air itself seemed lighter, as if the city finally released me from its grip. With the returned money and my savings, I moved us into a small bright condo filled with windows and quiet. Noah laughed more, slept better, and no longer asked why we had to send money away every month. One afternoon he proudly told me about an excellent grade and asked if we could celebrate. We walked hand in hand down a tree-lined street, sharing fried chicken and laughter. The past no longer loomed over us like a shadow. I looked at my son and felt gratitude for the storms that revealed my strength. The lies were buried behind prison walls, and what remained was truth, resilience, and a future I chose myself. For the first time since Daniel left our lives, I felt free, and that freedom was worth every step of the painful journey that led me here. The weeks that followed the arrests moved in a strange, slow rhythm, as if time itself needed to relearn how to flow without lies guiding it. I spent hours with lawyers and investigators repeating my story until it felt carved into my bones. Each retelling drained me, yet also reinforced the reality that none of it had been imagined. Every document, every recording, every image from that warehouse stitched together a truth that could no longer be undone. At night, when the city quieted, I sometimes woke gasping, expecting to hear footsteps on stairs or a knock at my door. But each time I reminded myself that Daniel was locked away and could no longer reach into my life. Noah sensed the change even though I shielded him from details. Children feel shifts the way animals feel storms. He asked fewer questions about his grandparents and stopped mentioning his father altogether. Instead, he clung closer to me, holding my hand longer when we crossed streets or sat together on the couch. I answered his questions, simply telling him that we no longer owed anyone money and that we were safe. His shoulders relaxed at those words, and I realized how deeply the tension had seeped into him without either of us noticing. The legal process required patience, and I Learned to sit with discomfort rather than run from it. Meetings blurred together as prosecutors explained timelines and consequences. They described Daniel's actions with terms like fraud and conspiracy, words that sounded clinical compared to the personal devastation they represented. When they told me Harold and Lorraine would not face prison due to age, but would be forced to repay everything, I felt a complex mix of relief and bitterness. Justice is rarely clean or satisfying, but it is necessary. I accepted that truth quietly. On the day I was called to give formal testimony, I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel steady. Standing in that room speaking about the earn, the money, the lies, my voice wavered only once when I mentioned Noah. The room grew silent then, and I understood that while money and documents mattered, the deepest betrayal was abandoning a child. When I finished speaking, I felt emptied yet lighter, as if releasing a burden I had carried alone for too long. During this time, Lucas remained a constant presence, checking and driving me to appointments, sitting with me in silence when words failed. I thanked him often, but gratitude felt too small for what he had given me, which was belief when doubt threatened to swallow me. He brushed it off, saying family looks out for family. His steady support reminded me that not all bonds are fragile or self-serving. As the trial date approached, news of the case spread quietly through the community. Neighbors who once pitied me now looked at me with a mix of admiration and discomfort. Some apologized for believing the story, others avoided eye contact altogether. I learned quickly that people prefer simple narratives and grow uneasy when confronted with how easily deception can thrive. I did not seek their validation anymore, my focus narrowed to protecting my peace. The trial itself felt unreal, like watching actors perform a script I knew by heart. Daniel sat at the defense table, smaller than I remembered, stripped of the confidence that once filled a room. He avoided my gaze throughout the proceedings, staring instead at his folded hands. When recordings played of his voice, laughing and mocking me, the sound echoed through the courtroom, and I felt something inside me finally detach. The man in those recordings was not my husband, he was a stranger, and acknowledging that freed me. When the verdict was read, I closed my eyes and breathed through the moment. 12 years was not a number that could return lost time or erase pain, but it marked an ending. The judge spoke of accountability and deterrence, words meant to resonate beyond one case. Harold and Lorraine wept openly, clinging to each other as sentences were explained. I felt no triumph, only a quiet acceptance that consequences had arrived. Leaving the courthouse that day, sunlight poured across the steps, warming my face. Reporters lingered nearby, but I declined to speak, turning instead toward the car, waiting to take me home. As we drove away, the city looked different, as if its edges had softened. For years, every street had felt heavy with obligation and fear. Now it simply existed, and so did I. With the repayment funds secured, I allowed myself to imagine a future not defined by survival alone. I sold the old apartment filled with memories and moved us into a smaller space flooded with light. Unpacking boxes felt ceremonial, each item placed with intention rather than habit. Noah chose his room first, arranging books and toys with excited focus. Seeing his joy affirmed that change had been the right choice. I began attending counseling sessions to untangle grief from anger and rebuild trust in my own instincts. Speaking aloud about manipulation and gaslighting revealed how subtly control can weave itself into love. The counselor reminded me that survival strategies are not flaws and that compassion becomes dangerous only when unguarded. Those words settled into me, slowly reshaping how I viewed my past choices. As months passed, routines stabilized and laughter returned naturally, not forced. Noah joined a basketball program, and I watched from the sidelines, cheering until my voice grew hoarse. Each ordinary moment felt extraordinary precisely because it was free of fear. At night, when we cooked together or read stories, I felt grounded in a present that no longer borrowed from the future. Sometimes memories still surfaced uninvited, the stairwell, the blue door, the envelope in my purse. When they did, I acknowledged them without letting them linger. Healing, I learned, is not forgetting, but choosing where to place attention. My attention belonged to my son, my work, my quiet mornings, and hopeful plans. I kept the evidence files locked away, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of resilience. They represented the moment I chose to question rather than comply, and that choice changed everything. When doubt crept in, I remembered opening that urn and seeing stones instead of ashes. Truth may arrive brutally, but once seen, it cannot be unseen. Looking ahead, I felt cautious optimism. Trust would return gradually, and on my terms. Love too, perhaps one day. For now, I embraced the life I had reclaimed, grateful for the strength discovered under pressure. Storms had torn through my world, but they also cleared space for something honest and enduring. And in that space, I finally felt at home. Life after the trial did not transform overnight into something perfect or effortless. Instead, it unfolded quietly with small, steady changes that slowly rewired my sense of normal. Mornings no longer began with the dread of envelopes or deadlines, and nights no longer ended with numbers spinning in my head. The absence of fear felt strange at first, like a silence too wide to trust. Yet with time, that silence softened into peace, and I learned to rest inside it without bracing for impact. Noah adapted faster than I did, as children often do when stability finally arrives. His laughter came easier, his sleep deeper, and his questions fewer. He stopped asking why we could not buy certain things or why I worked so much overtime. Instead, he talked about friends, school games, and dreams of becoming a coach one day. Watching him stretch into confidence made every sacrifice worth it and reminded me why I had endured so long without breaking. I focused on rebuilding, not just financially but emotionally. I took on projects at work that challenged me and earned recognition that had long been overdue. Without the constant drain of payments, I could save, plan, and invest in experiences rather than survival. I signed Noah up for activities he loved and allowed myself small pleasures like new furniture, plants by the window, and weekends that belonged to us alone. Lucas remained close, though our roles shifted. Now that the crisis had passed, we laughed more, talked about ordinary things, and shared meals without urgency hanging between us. Our bond deepened into something grounded in trust and respect, rather than adrenaline and fear. I appreciated his presence without leaning on it, and that balance felt healthy and earned. One afternoon, months later, I received a letter confirming the final restitution payment had cleared. The chapter that once consumed my life closed with a simple line of text. I read it twice, then folded the paper carefully, placing it in a drawer, not as a trophy but as an endpoint. There was no dramatic release, just a quiet exhale that traveled through my entire body. I chose to tell Noah the truth in gentle pieces when the time felt right. Not the cruelty or manipulation, but the fact that his father had made choices that kept him away, and that those choices were not our fault. He listened, seriously processing more than I expected, and then asked if we were safe now. When I said yes, he nodded as if that was all he truly needed to know. The city around us continued its rhythm, indifferent to personal victories and losses. Yet, I experienced it differently now. Streets once associated with anxiety became paths to possibility. I took longer walks, noticing trees, storefronts, and the way light shifted across buildings at dusk. Presence replaced vigilance, and that shift changed everything. I returned once more to the old building, not out of obligation but closure. Standing across the street, I looked up at the fifth-floor windows, now open and unguarded. New tenants moved in, unaware of the history contained within those walls. I felt no urge to confront the space or reclaim anything from it. It held no power over me anymore, and that realization was liberating. Healing came in waves, some days effortless, other days demanding patience. There were moments when memories resurfaced unexpectedly, triggered by a sound, a smell, a phrase. When they did, I acknowledged them without judgment, allowing them to pass like weather. I learned that strength does not mean immunity from pain, but the ability to move forward without being defined by it. Began volunteering with a local support group for widows and single parents, not sharing details but offering understanding. Listening to others reinforced how common, quiet suffering can be, and how rarely people question narratives handed to them. My experience became a quiet tool rather than a wound, and that transformation felt meaningful. Noah and I created new traditions: Sunday breakfasts, movie nights, spontaneous trips to the park. These routines anchored us and replaced rituals once tied to loss with ones rooted in choice. Joy grew from consistency rather than spectacle, and I treasured that simplicity. Occasionally, I wondered who I might have been had none of this happened. Then I realized that question no longer mattered. The woman I became was forged through endurance, clarity, and courage. She knew her limits, trusted her instincts, and valued peace above approval. That identity felt earned and unshakable. As seasons changed, our home filled with light, laughter, and growth. I hung new photos on the walls, moments captured without shadows looming behind them. Each image represented not what we survived but what we built afterward, and that distinction mattered. The past did not disappear, but it lost its grip. Justice had been served not just through sentences and restitution, but through my refusal to remain trapped in bitterness. Forgiveness came slowly, not as absolution but as release. I let go of the need to understand Daniel or his parents beyond acknowledging their choices. Their story was no longer mine to carry. One evening while walking home, Noah slipped his hand into mine and said he felt lucky. I asked why, and he shrugged, saying, "Because we were happy now." His words settled into my heart like a quiet affirmation of everything I had fought for. Happiness did not arrive with fireworks, it arrived with safety, honesty, and love. Standing at our window that night, looking out at the city lights, I felt gratitude, not for the pain endured but for the clarity it forced upon me. I had learned to question, to protect, and to choose myself without apology. The future stretched ahead unwritten, and that openness felt like a gift. My life was no longer defined by loss or deception, but by resilience and intention. I moved forward, carrying lessons rather than burdens, and that shift changed the weight of everything. The story that once began with grief and obligation ended with strength and freedom. And in that ending, I finally found peace.